The sheets felt wrong. Too crisp. Too new. Smelling faintly of a lavender plug-in air freshener. Not the lemon verbena soap I use at home. I kept my eyes closed. My breathing slow and even. A shallow rhythm I'd perfected over the last few nights. My heart, however, was a frantic drum against my ribs. A wild bird trapped in a cage of bone. From the living room, their voices were hushed. But the thin walls of the guest room were no match for the chilling clarity of their words. The injection is ready, Vince whispered. His voice, usually so smooth and solicitous, was sharp, brittle with anticipation. I'll dissolve her sleeping pill in her evening tea. Just a little stronger this time. Once she's out, it'll be quick and clean. A faint whimper. Claire. Are you sure? Vince. What if someone finds out? Finds out what? He scoffed. The sound low and guttural. An old woman with a history of high blood pressure passes away peacefully in her sleep? It's a tragedy. Honey. A sad, but perfectly natural tragedy. The doctor has already signed off on the preliminary report. By the time anyone asks questions, we'll be long gone. And her assets will be ours. It's foolproof. I focused on the sound of my own feigned sleep, the gentle rise and fall of my chest. I was the lamb, tucked into bed by the butchers themselves. They thought I was a fragile old woman, oblivious and weak. They thought I was the main course. But they had no idea I had already rewritten the menu. My story, the story of my death sentence, didn't begin in that silent, terrifying bedroom. It began a month ago. With a plea for help. A mother's siren call. People often say that the most valuable inheritance we can leave behind is our values. I agree. But sometimes, children aren't interested in values. They're interested in value. And to get to it, they're willing to use your own life as a shortcut. My name is Eleanor Vance. I am 72 years old, and I have spent my entire life as a cook. First, for a wealthy family on the Upper East Side, then for my husband, and finally, for my daughter. I am the woman in the background, the one who nurtures, who cares, who ensures everyone is satisfied. What I didn't know was that for my son-in-law, Vin, I wasn't just the cook. I was the meal, and he planned on serving me cold. A month ago, my small, beloved brownstone apartment in Carroll Gardens, Brooklyn, was my sanctuary. The morning sun would slant through the kitchen window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and catching the silver in the framed photograph of my late husband, Arthur, on the wall. He was in his doorman's uniform, a man of quiet dignity and unwavering honesty. Our life together wasn't written in grand ballrooms, but in the service hallways and lobby of a luxury building, where we built our world one saved dollar at a time. The apartment was the culmination of that life, proof that hard work and honor meant something. That morning, the scent of freshly brewed coffee and toasted sourdough filled the air. I was humming an old tune Arthur used to love when the phone rang, its shrill cry cutting through the morning peace. It was my daughter, Claire. Her voice was thin, watery with tears. Mom? I feel awful. I immediately felt my own heart clench with worry. What is it? Sweetie, what's wrong? It's this new flu. The one on the news. I can't even get out of bed. My whole body aches. She let out a weak, pathetic cough that sounded practiced even through the phone. Vince is run ragged at work. And I need help with the house. With meals. Can you come stay for a few days? I went. Mothers are programmed to run toward the sound of their children's pain. I packed a small suitcase, watered my ferns, and asked my neighbor, Mrs. Rossi, to collect my mail. I left my cozy, familiar world in Brooklyn and took a taxi to their house in Forest Hills, Queens. Their home was the opposite of mine. It was modern, with vast, empty white walls, polished concrete floors, and furniture that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Not a home. It was cold, beautiful, and utterly devoid of soul. It was everything they ever wanted. I found Claire exactly as she'd described, pale and listless in their enormous king-sized bed. Vince was the picture of concern. His brow furrowed as he fluffed her pillows. "This new virus is a monster, Ellie," he said, calling me by the nickname only Arthur ever used. It felt wrong coming from his lips. "It just knocks a person flat. The doctor prescribed some strong medication. That's why she's sleeping so much. Thank God you're here. You're our guardian angel." I fell into my role without a second thought. I unpacked in their sterile guest room, tied on an apron, and took over the kitchen. I made chicken noodle soup from scratch, the way Claire had loved it as a child. I brewed herbal teas. I tidied the house, the quiet hum of my work a prayer for my daughter's recovery. I watched over her, my mother's heart aching with worry. But underneath the worry, a small alarm, an instinct that we older women learn not to ignore, began to sound. There was something off in the atmosphere of the house. The way Vince meticulously controlled Claire's medication, crushing pills into her juice and watching until she drank every last drop. The way he always answered for her when I asked how she was feeling. "She's still very weak, Ellie." The doctor said to let her rest. And Claire's weakness seemed artificial, drugged. Her eyes, when she was awake, were glassy and unfocused. She would drift off mid-sentence, her head lolling to the side. It didn't feel like the flu. Felt like sedation. The discovery, the moment the floor opened up and I saw the abyss, happened on a Wednesday afternoon. Vince had gone out for an important meeting. Claire was in her usual deep, medicated sleep. I thought she felt a bit warm, so I went into their master bedroom to look for a thermometer in the nightstand drawer. Her side was cluttered with magazines and half-empty water glasses. I tried Vince's. I opened the drawer. Beneath a pile of neatly rolled black socks, I found a large manila envelope. My name, Eleanor Vance, was written on it in Vince's confident, slanted handwriting. Curiosity, that old and dangerous friend, got the better of me. My hands trembled as I lifted the flap. The first document I pulled out turned my blood to ice. It was a will. My will. On it, with a signature that was a crude imitation of my own, I left all my worldly possessions, me apartment in Carroll Gardens, valued at nearly $1 million, and my life savings of $200,000, my one and only beloved daughter, Claire. And I named, as the executor of my estate, my trusted and capable son-in-law, Vincent Thorne. My brain refused to process it. Why would they do this? Why forge a will when Claire was already my sole heir? My trembling fingers pulled the second document from the envelope, and the world stopped spinning. It was a death certificate. Mine. It listed my full name, my date of birth, my marital status as widowed. In the field for cause of death, typed in stark, official letters, were the words, acute myocardial infarction, natural causes. The name of the medical examiner was a smudge I didn't recognize. But the worst part, the detail that transformed horror into pure, absolute terror, was the date. It was filled in, and the date was not in the past. It was in the future. Next Wednesday, exactly 1 week from today. The air vanished from my lungs. I sank to the floor, the papers clutched in my hand, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would burst from my chest. They weren't just planning to rob me. They were planning to murder me. Claire's flu, her weakness, my presence here, in their house, away from my neighbors, from my routine, from anyone who would notice if I suddenly fell ill. It all clicked into place, forming a macabre, terrifying picture. I wasn't the guardian angel. I was the lamb who had walked willingly into the slaughterhouse. Panic threatened to drown me. I wanted to scream, to run, to flee into the street. But then, the cook took over. The woman who spent 50 years working under the intense pressure of restaurant kitchens, where chaos was a constant threat and method was the only salvation. Where there is danger, there must be silence. Where there is a plot, there must be a counterplot. I stood up, my legs shaking. With a surgeon's precision, I took out my cell phone. I photographed every inch of those horrifying documents, the forged will, the predated death certificate, every signature, every stamp. I slid everything back into the envelope, placed it exactly as I had found it beneath the socks, and gently closed the drawer. My life's greatest performance was about to begin. I walked out of the bedroom, my face a mask of maternal concern. I went to the kitchen and prepared a cup of chamomile tea. When Claire finally stirred, groggy and disoriented, I brought it to her, forcing the most loving smile I could muster. Feeling any better, my darling? I asked, my voice smooth as butter. A little, Mom, she mumbled. My head hurts. Drink this tea. It will help you rest. As she sipped it, I watched her. I studied the daughter I had raised, the girl I had loved more than life itself. Was she a victim in this, a pawn being drugged into submission by her monstrous husband? Or was she a willing accomplice in the plan to murder her own mother? The uncertainty was a special kind of torture, a poison seeping into the marrow of my bones. That afternoon, I invented an excuse. I need to pop out to the pharmacy, I announced cheerfully. I want to get you a better cough syrup. No need, Ellie. I can go later, Vince said, having just returned home. His smile didn't reach his eyes. I insist, Vin, I replied, playing the part of the stubborn, doting grandmother. I like the walk. A little fresh air will do me good. The moment I stepped onto the street, the air of freedom and danger hit me like a physical blow. I didn't dial 911. They would ask questions, create a commotion, and scare my targets into hiding. I needed someone who understood strategy, silence, and the art of the hunt. I dialed the number of the only man in the world I trusted as much as I had trusted Arthur. Frank Miller, a retired NYPD detective, a widower who had lived in our building for 30 years. He had watched me raise Claire. He had held my hand at Arthur's funeral. He knew my honor. He knew my grit. He answered on the second ring. Miller. Frank? It's Eleanor. Arthur Vance's Eleanor. Ellie. My friend. What a surprise. Is everything all right? His voice, always calm and gravelly, was a balm to my frayed nerves. No, Frank. Nothing is all right, I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the terror inside me. I need your help. It's a matter of life and death. Literally. I found a small, anonymous park a few blocks away. A sad patch of green with a couple of weary benches. I sat down, my back to the street, and told Frank everything. I spoke in a low, steady voice, detailing the discovery of the will, the horror of the death certificate, the way Claire was being kept in a drugged haze. As I talked, I sent him the photos I'd taken of the documents. The images, stark and clinical on my phone screen, were irrefutable proof of the nightmare I was living. He listened in complete silence, without interrupting. When I finished, the silence on the other end of the line stretched for a long, heavy minute. I could picture him in his armchair, the worn leather groaning under his weight, his face grim, his detective's mind piecing together the ugly puzzle. Eleanor, he finally said, and the usual warmth in his voice had been replaced by a cold, hard fury. Stay exactly where you are. Do not go back to that house. I'm sending an unmarked car to pick you up right now. A wave of relief washed over me, so potent it almost buckled my knees. The thought of being whisked away to safety, of being anywhere but that cold, sterile house, was intoxicating, but it was followed immediately by a surge of cold resolve. No, Frank, I said, my voice firm. If I disappear, they'll know something is wrong. They'll run. Vince is slippery. You know that. We'll lose them. And they'll just try again later. I took a deep breath. The city air tasting of gasoline and fear. I have to go back. I have to pretend I don't know anything. They've marked my death for next Wednesday. That gives us 7 days. There was another pause. I could hear the faint sound of him breathing. The ticking of a grandfather clock in his apartment. You are the bravest woman I have ever known. Eleanor Vance. He said quietly. All right. We do it your way. The hunt was on. Here's what you're going to do. He instructed. His voice shifting into the familiar cadence of a commander laying out a battle plan. Go back to the house. Act normal. Keep being the helpful, naive mother-in-law. My team and I will take it from here. Your phone will be mirrored starting tonight. We'll have surveillance on the street. We'll investigate this doctor. This notary. We're going to build a cage around them. Piece by piece. But you, Ellie, you have to be our eyes and ears inside. Do you understand the danger? I understand, Frank. I said. My gaze fixed on a pigeon pecking at a discarded pretzel. I've spent my life in the kitchen. I know better than anyone that revenge is a dish best served cold. I walked to the pharmacy and bought a bottle of the most expensive cough syrup they had. Felt like a prop. A piece of a costume for the role I was about to play. Holding the small plastic bag. I walked back to the house. My heart pounded with every step. I was returning to the scene of my own planned murder. Vince opened the door. That fake, charming smile plastered on his face. Get the medicine. Ellie, you were gone for a while. I was starting to get worried. I looked at the man who had signed my death warrant and handed him the bag. I forced the most fragile, trusting smile I could manage. I did. Vince. The pharmacist said this one is very good. It'll help Claire sleep like an angel. I stepped back inside the house. The lamb had returned to the slaughterhouse. But this time, the lamb knew exactly where the wolf hid his teeth. The countdown had begun. He had 1 week to execute his crime. And I had 1 week to prepare for his downfall. Living under the same roof as your own executioners is an exercise in control that drains the soul. Every day of that week was a performance. I was the lead actress in a theater of the absurd, playing the part of the sweet, slightly dotty old woman, while inside, every nerve in my body vibrated with terror and rage. I served them breakfast with a smile. Sleep well, my dears? Vince would reply with his sickening solicitude. We did. Ellie, thanks to your care. You truly are our guardian angel. The cynicism was so blatant I had to grip the edge of the kitchen counter to keep my hands from shaking. Claire grew paler and more lethargic each day. She barely touched the food I made for her. I watched Vince crush the flu tablets and stir the powder into her orange juice. My mother's heart twisted in agony. He wasn't just planning my death. He was slowly weakening my daughter, turning her into a compliant, witless accomplice. The only witness who could potentially stop him. Was she a victim? Or a volunteer? That question haunted my sleepless nights. In the silence of the guest room, with only the hum of the refrigerator for company, memories would come. Not to torture me, but to remind me of what I was fighting for. To remind me of the life they were trying to erase. My story with Arthur wasn't glamorous. He was the doorman, a king in his small, uniformed kingdom. I was the cook for one of the penthouse families, my hands always smelling of garlic and dreams. Our love blossomed on the service stairs, in stolen moments between his shifts and my meal preparations. We were the invisible army that made that world of appearances function. And with the sweat of our labor, we built our own fortress. Every saved penny was a brick. Our dream wasn't a penthouse with a view of Central Park. It was a small apartment of our own, away from the whims of employers. A place to raise our daughter, Claire. with the security we never had. Arthur was a man of almost painful honesty. What isn't ours? Ellie, we don't want. He'd always say. He saw the greed in the eyes of some of the residents, the way they worshipped money, and he feared our daughter would be contaminated by it. Our inheritance for her. My love, he told me one night, his hand warm on mine, won't be money. It will be our example. When he died, sudden, massive heart attack in his lobby chair on a quiet Sunday, their world briefly mourned him. Arthur was an institution. They said. I found myself a widow at 48, with a 16-year-old daughter and a promise to keep. That Claire would have a future built on the rock of her father's values. I kept working, stitching my grief together with the threads of my daily labor. And I succeeded. With the money we had saved for 25 years, combined with Arthur's small life insurance policy, I bought our dream apartment in Carroll Gardens. It was small, facing the back, but it was ours. It was the proof that Arthur's life of hard work and honor had mattered. Claire grew up, a beautiful girl, but with a restlessness in her eyes, a chronic dissatisfaction with the simplicity of our life. The arrival of Vince was like throwing gasoline on that fire. He was a car salesman, charming, ambitious, and with a deep contempt for what he called a poor person's mentality. Your mother is a saint, baby. I once overheard him tell Claire, their voices drifting from her room. But she has no vision. All that money sitting in a savings account is a crime. We could be investing it, multiplying it. The first major sacrifice I made, the first crack in my fortress, was their wedding. Claire wanted a grand affair, a party that wouldn't embarrass her in front of Vince's successful friends. I knew we couldn't afford it, but her tears, her veiled accusations that my frugality was robbing her of her dream, wore me down. I took $30,000 from my savings, the money that was meant for my own security, and paid for the party. Claire's radiant smile in the wedding photos was the receipt for my sacrifice. The second, more devastating blow came a year later. Vin, who had been fired from the dealership, had a brilliant idea to start a small wine import business. He knew nothing about wine, but he knew about appearances. It's a business for the elite. Ellie, the profit margins are huge. He assured me, armed with fake spreadsheets and empty promises. He and Claire pressured me for months. There were daily visits, endless phone calls. It was psychological torture. Don't you trust your son-in-law? Don't you want to see your daughter have a good life? Exhausted, wanting only peace, I gave in again. I gave them $75,000, the largest chunk of my savings, the very heart of Arthur's legacy. The business, course, failed in less than 6 months. The money wasn't used to import wine, but to finance expensive dinners, weekend trips, and designer clothes. They burned my future to warm their present, and there wasn't even an apology, only the frustration of someone who had lost an expensive toy. It was after that that the dynamic shifted. Who had once been the protective mother became the obstacle. The rest of my money, the last $100,000, was the final barrier between them and total financial ruin. And I refused to yield anymore. That's when the look in his eyes changed. My presence, my health, my very life became a problem to be solved. The memory dissolved, and the reality of the guest room returned with a vengeance. The sound of the TV in the living room, Vince's laughter at some sitcom, the banality of evil. He was planning my murder. And while he waited, he watched television. My phone, tucked under my pillow, vibrated. It was a text from an untraceable number. As Frank and I had arranged. Doctor is fake. Medical license non-existent. Notary office is a print shop in the Bronx. The will is a crude forgery. We are monitoring their every move. Stay calm. We are with you. F. The message was a life jacket in a sea of terror. I was not alone. That night, Dinner. I continued my performance. I served the pot roast, my hand trembling just slightly. Are you all right, Ellie? You look pale, Vince said, his voice dripping with crocodile concern. Just tired, dear. This flu of Claire's has me worried sick, I replied, looking at my daughter, who ate in silence, her gaze vacant. Well, she'll be better soon. Don't you worry, he said with a smile that chilled me to the bone. By next week, everything will be resolved. You'll see. We'll all have so much peace. The veiled promise of my own death. I swallowed hard. I needed to know. I had to know if my daughter, my little girl, was a victim or a willing accomplice. Claire. Honey, I said, my voice soft. I've been thinking about the money. I know I was hard on you both, but if it's for your health, I'll help. I'll give you everything. I just need you not Vincito look me in the eye and tell me it's true. Tell me you're really this sick. It was the final test. I gave her the chance to back down, to confess, to choose me. The silence at the table was absolute. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. Claire slowly lifted her head. Her eyes, usually so vacant, were now sharp and focused. And in them, I saw the answer. There was no fear, no doubt. There was only the same cold, hard greed that was in her husband's eyes. I am sick, Mom, she said, her voice firm, without a trace of hesitation. And we need the money. It's the least you can do for me. And in that instant, my mother's heart finally, definitively, broke. The daughter I had raised had died a long time ago. In her place sat a stranger, an accomplice, a thief who was using my love as a weapon. I see, was all I could say. We'll sort it out next week. I returned to my room, my body heavy with the certainty of her betrayal. I looked at the calendar on the wall. Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. For more days. 4 days until my scheduled death. The countdown continued. They thought they were in control. But my silent, invisible army was already in position. The trap was set. All I had to do was survive long enough to spring it. The days that followed crawled by with the torturous slowness of a nightmare. Each hour was a performance. Each meal a test of courage. I smiled. I praised Vince's terrible attempts at cooking when he insisted on giving me a break. I asked about Claire's non-existent symptoms, all while my stomach churned with a toxic cocktail of fear and fury. My communication with Frank became a game of coded messages, like something out of the old spy movies Arthur used to love. I texted a prepaid burner phone Frank had arranged to be delivered by a florist. My texts were disguised as conversations with my cousin Martha, a fictional character we had invented. Martha. Today's recipe calls for a very bitter ingredient. I would write. That meant, Vince is acting more aggressive. Tomorrow I'm making that fluffy cornbread you love. That was our code for. All is calm for now. I'm sticking to the plan. And Vince's plan was becoming clearer by the day. He started leaving pamphlets from funeral homes on the coffee table. Accidentally, of course. He would read articles aloud from magazines about the hidden dangers of heart disease in seniors. It was a calculated campaign of psychological warfare. He was trying to plant the seed of death in my mind, so that when it arrived, it would seem natural, inevitable. Are you feeling all right, Ellie? He would ask me every evening, his eyes fixed on mine, searching for any sign of weakness. No little twinges in your chest? No shortness of breath? At your age, you can never be too careful. I would just smile my best naive grandmother smile. I feel wonderful. Vince. Heart as strong as an ox. Every word was a lie. And every lie was a weapon. I was fighting for my life in a war of whispers and smiles. Claire was a ghost. She drifted through the house, pale and silent, her eyes always shadowed, as if the medication Vince was giving her was draining not just her strength, but her very soul. Sometimes, I would catch her looking at me with a strange expression, a mixture of pity and something that looked like guilt. But she never said a word. Her complicity, whether born of fear or greed, was a wall of silence I no longer had the strength to try and break through. The police surveillance was my invisible shield. Frank updated me in our coded language. A plainclothed officer was parked down the street, pretending to be a utility worker. Another had a direct line of sight into the front of the house from an apartment across the way. The house was wired. Every word Vince and Claire spoke was being recorded. They thought they were the predators, stalking their prey in a carefully controlled environment. They had no idea they were the specimens, trapped under the microscope of the NYPD. On Monday, 2 days before my scheduled murder, Vince made his next move. "Ellie, I have some fantastic news," he announced at breakfast, his voice booming with false enthusiasm. "A friend of mine is a financial advisor, a real genius. He told me about an incredible investment opportunity, but it's time sensitive. We have to act fast." I stirred my oatmeal, my hand steady. "Oh? What kind of investment?" "It's a real estate deal. A guaranteed return, but it requires a significant upfront investment." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "With the money from your savings, we could double it in 6 months. Imagine that. Ellie, we could finally give Claire the life she deserves. A life without worry." He was trying to get me to transfer the money before he killed me, to make the theft cleaner. It was sloppy. It was greedy. And it gave me an opening. "Oh, Vin, that sounds wonderful," I said, my voice full of admiration. "But you know how old-fashioned I am. I don't understand all this modern banking. And Arthur always told me never to sign anything without reading it carefully. I keep all my important papers, my bank book, everything, in a safe deposit box at my bank in Brooklyn." This was a lie. I hadn't used a safe deposit box in years, but it was a necessary one. Vince's smile tightened at the edges. "A safe deposit box? Well, that's no problem. We can drive to Brooklyn tomorrow and get the papers." "Tomorrow is Tuesday," I said thoughtfully. "The bank has shorter hours. And I have an old friend from the neighborhood I promised to have lunch with. How about Wednesday? We could go in the morning. And I could treat you both to lunch at that little Italian place Arthur and I used to love." I had just proposed a date for my own murder. I was inviting them to the bank on the very day they planned for me to die. I needed to see his reaction. The flicker of triumph in his eyes was unmistakable. It was perfect for him. They could get what they needed from the bank. And then, later in the day, the tragedy would strike. There would be a clear, recent record of me being out and about, looking perfectly fine. It made their story even more believable. "Wednesday sounds perfect. Ellie," he said, his smile returning. Genuine this time. Absolutely perfect. That night, the weight of it all pressed down on me. I lay in the dark, the silence of the house thick and suffocating. The performance was exhausting me. The constant vigilance, the forced smiles, the terror simmering just beneath the surface. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel the full, crushing weight of my daughter's betrayal. I thought of her as a little girl, her small hand in mine as we walked through Carroll Park. I remembered the scraped knees I had kissed, the bedtime stories I had read, the lullabies I had sung. Where had that little girl gone? How had the beautiful child I raised turned into this cold-eyed stranger who would trade her mother's life for a bigger house and a fancier car? Tears I hadn't allowed myself to cry began to slide silently from the corners of my eyes, tracing hot paths to my ears. I wasn't just mourning my own potential death. I was mourning hers. The death of her conscience. The death of her soul. Arthur had been so afraid of this, of the world's greed poisoning her. And it had. His greatest fear had come true. The vibration of my phone brought me back. A message from Frank. He's talking to someone. A man named Dr. Alistair Finch. We've been tracking him. Not a doctor. He's a disgraced mortician who lost his license. Vince is arranging for him to sign the death certificate. The price is $10,000. He wants to meet Vince tomorrow to get a cash deposit. My grief instantly solidified into cold, hard rage. They had hired a ghoul to erase me, to rubber stamp their crime. I texted back to Frank. Martha. The butcher is sharpening his knives. His reply was almost instantaneous. The chef is ready in the kitchen. Hold on. We're almost there. Tuesday. The eve of the day marked on my death certificate was the longest day of my life. I barely slept, my mind replaying the plan Frank and I had finalized. Every detail had to be perfect. My life depended on it. I woke up with a strange sense of calm. The fear was still there. A cold knot in my stomach. But it was overshadowed by a powerful resolve. I was not a victim. I was a fighter. I was Arthur Vance's wife. And I would not go down without a fight. I made pancakes for breakfast, just as I did every Sunday when Claire was a child. I hummed as I flipped them, filling the cold, modern kitchen with the warm, buttery scent of a happier time. Pancakes, Claire said as she shuffled into the kitchen. For a fleeting second, her eyes lit up with a spark of genuine childhood delight. It was a ghost of the girl she used to be. The spark died as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the usual vacant expression. Just like old times, I said, placing a stack in front of her. Vince came in, dressed in a sharp suit. Big day at work, he said, kissing Claire on the top of her head. He had to meet his doctor to pay the deposit. He grabbed a pancake, folding it in half and eating it as he walked to the door. Don't forget, Ellie. Tomorrow morning. Brooklyn. Then we get this whole financial mess sorted out. I won't forget, I said, smiling sweetly. The day passed in a blur of forced normalcy. I watched an old movie on TV. I pretended to read a book. I listened to the quiet movements in the house. Every creak of the floorboards. Every whispered conversation. They were getting ready. They were preparing the stage for the final act. And so was I. That evening, I took a long, hot shower. I put on my favorite soft nightgown. I sat on the edge of my bed and looked at the picture of Arthur on my phone's lock screen. His smile was kind, his eyes full of a love that had transcended even death. Wish me luck, my love, I whispered to the image. Tomorrow, I fight for the life we built together. I fight for the honor of your name. I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me. I had a plan. I had an army. And I had the unshakable conviction that the values Arthur and I had lived by, honesty, integrity, courage, were infinitely more powerful than the greed that was festering in the other room. They thought they were closing a chapter. But they had no idea I was about to write the ending. Wednesday morning arrived. Gray and damp. The sky over Queens the color of unpolished silver. The day of my scheduled death. I rose from bed. My body heavy with tension but my mind as sharp as a chef's knife. The calm I'd felt the night before had solidified into a cold, unwavering focus. This was not a day for fear. This was a day for justice. I went to the kitchen and found Vince whistling a cheerful, tuneless melody as he stood over the stove, a teapot in his hand. The sight of his manufactured happiness was so grotesque it made my stomach clench. Good morning, my dear Eleanor, he said, turning with a smile that was all teeth. It was the first time he'd used my full name. It sounded like an epitaph. I've prepared your special chamomile tea, with a few drops of honey to sweeten the day. I knew what was in that honey. It wasn't just sweetener. It was the first stage of his plan. A powerful sedative to ensure I was pliable and sleepy for our trip to the bank, and to set the stage for my natural passing later. The dosage would be just enough to make me drowsy, but not enough to raise suspicion. The lethal dose would come later. How thoughtful of you, Vince. Thank you, I replied, my voice a perfect imitation of a grateful old woman. I took the mug from him, my hands deliberately shaky. The warmth of the ceramic seeped into my cold fingers. I walked into the living room and settled into a plush armchair, the mug cradled in my hands. I brought it to my lips, tilted it back, and made a soft sipping sound, but only let the barest drop of the drugged tea touch my tongue. It was bitter beneath the honey. I held the warm mug, letting the steam rise and cloud my glasses, the perfect picture of morning tranquility. After about 15 minutes, I began my performance. Oh, I said softly, pressing my hand to my forehead. I'm feeling a little dizzy. I let my head loll back against the chair. I think my blood pressure might be acting up. Vince and Claire, who was sitting on the sofa listlessly scrolling through her phone, exchanged a look. I saw it from the corner of my eye. It was a glance of triumph, of a plan clicking perfectly into place. It's just exhaustion, Ellie, Vince said, his voice oozing with that false, syrupy concern. You've been pushing yourself so hard taking care of Claire. Why don't you go lie down for a bit before we head to the bank? A little rest will do you wonders. I think you might be right, I murmured, using the armrest to push myself up with exaggerated difficulty. I do feel so very weak all of a sudden. I'll just rest my eyes for a moment. I walked slowly toward the guest room, steadying myself on the backs of chairs as I went. Each step was part of the script. Each feigned moment of weakness was a carefully placed brick in the trap I was building. I entered the room and closed the door, but did not lock it. I lay down on the bed, on my back, and folded my hands over my stomach. It was the signal. Frank had told me the moment I was in that room, the audio and video surveillance inside the house would be fed directly to a tactical team, assembled in a van down the street. From this moment on, I was no longer just an actress. I was the bait. In the silence of my room, I strained my ears. I could hear their hushed whispers from the living room. She's down, Vince said, his voice a low hum of satisfaction. The tea worked faster than I thought. She'll be groggy and compliant for the bank run. It's perfect. We go. We get her to sign the transfer form. She'll be too out of it to even read them properly. And then we bring her back here for a nap. And then? Claire's voice was barely a whisper. And then? Vince said. I'll give her the final dose. The wonder. Finch prepared. It'll mimic a heart attack. She'll just slip away. We wait an hour. We call 911. We cry. We play the grieving children. It's clean, simple, and no one will ever know. So that was the full plan. A drug trip to the bank, a forced signature, and then a lethal injection disguised as a nap. It was more cruel, more clinical than I had imagined. The sheer cold-bloodedness of it sent a tremor of pure terror through me. But I suffocated it. I had to trust Frank. I had to trust the plan. The minutes stretched into an eternity. My heart hammered against my ribs. A frantic prisoner. I counted the seconds, matching them to my own steady, even breaths. 1, 2, 3. Then I heard it. A sound from the living room. Not of their whispers, but a sharp, sudden thud. A muffled shout from Vince. A startled cry from Claire. The sounds were followed by a new voice. A voice of authority. Calm and loud. NYPD. Stay where you are. Hands where I can see them. I heard the chaos erupt. The sound of furniture being overturned. The desperate, guttural denial from Vince. Claire's high-pitched, hysterical shriek. The firm, commanding voices of the police officers. On the ground. Now. Hands behind your head. I remained on the bed. My eyes squeezed shut. Tears finally broke free. Hot and liberating. Streaming down my temples and into my hair. The sound of sirens began to wail outside. Growing closer and closer. It was no longer a sound of danger. It was the most beautiful symphony I had ever heard. After a time that felt like both a second and a lifetime, there was a gentle knock on my bedroom door. "Eleanor?" It was Frank's voice. "It's me. You can open the door. It's over." I pushed myself up, my legs as unsteady as a newborn colt's, and opened the door. The living room I had just left was unrecognizable, swarming with uniformed police officers. And in the middle of it all, I saw them, Vince and Claire, face down on the floor, their hands being cuffed behind their backs. Vince's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred and disbelief. He looked at me as an officer pulled him to his feet, and his eyes spat venom. But it was Claire's face that I will never forget. As another officer helped her up, her tear-streaked face turned toward me. She saw me standing in the doorway, fully awake, fully aware, and utterly unharmed. And in that instant, her expression shattered. The panic and confusion were replaced by a look of dawning, sickening comprehension. She understood everything. The dizziness, the convenient nap, the trap. Our eyes met across the chaotic room, and in my daughter's gaze, I did not see remorse. I saw only the raw, stunned shock of a predator who had just realized it was she who had been hunted all along. Frank came to my side, his presence a solid, comforting wall. He placed a protective arm around my shoulders. "I told you we'd get them, Ellie," he said, his voice soft. "The house is secure now. You're safe." I let him guide me through the swarm of police officers, past the overturned coffee table where Vince's funeral pamphlets were scattered like fallen leaves. As I passed my daughter, who was being led toward the front door, she wouldn't look at me. She kept her head down, her shoulders shaking with sobs of self-pity. Not repentance. I felt nothing. Not hatred. Not pity. Just a vast, hollow emptiness. The cook had served her final, vengeful dish. The mother had buried her last hope. Frank drove me back to Brooklyn, back to my small, safe apartment in Carroll Gardens. The feeling of turning my own key in my own lock, of stepping into my own space, was overwhelming. The familiar scent of old books and lemon verbena soap wrapped around me like a blanket. The sight of Arthur's photograph on the wall, his kind eyes smiling at me, brought a fresh wave of tears. I was home. I was alive. That night, after Frank had gone, promising to handle all the bureaucracy and paperwork, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went into my kitchen, pulled out the flour, eggs, and sugar, and began to make a chocolate cake from scratch. Arthur's favorite. The hum of the electric mixer, the rich, sweet smell filling the apartment. It was all a ritual of purification. It was a reclaiming of my space, my life, my identity. When the cake was done, I cut a warm, thick slice and sat down at my small kitchen table with a glass of cold milk. The silence in my apartment was no longer one of loneliness, but of peace. Peace I had fought for. A peace I had earned at a terrible price. The inheritance they had coveted so deeply was safe in the bank. But my true inheritance, the one Arthur had left, one made of honor, courage, and resilience, that was right here, inside me. It was battered and bruised, but it was intact. It was stronger than ever. The countdown was over. I had survived. And now, the rest of my Lithia gift I had nearly lost could finally begin. The months following the arrest were a blur of legal proceedings, depositions, and a quiet, persistent grief. I wasn't mourning the loss of Vince and Claire in a physical sense. I was mourning the loss of the family I thought I had, the daughter I thought I knew. Each visit to the district attorney's office, each document I had to sign as the victim and principal witness, was a painful reminder of the depth of their betrayal. The cook, who once worried about the seasoning of a soup, now had to learn the bitter vocabulary of the penal code. Attempted murder in the first degree, grand larceny, forgery. While the justice of men ground slowly forward, I was fighting a more intimate battle, the one to relearn how to live. My small apartment in Carroll Gardens, once my sanctuary, now felt haunted. Every corner held the memory of a visit, a false smile, a carefully constructed lie. The silence was heavy, and loneliness was an unwelcome companion. The ghost of my daughter's laughter from years past echoed in the empty rooms, a cruel counterpoint to the memory of her cold-eyed greed. It was Frank who pulled me from the torpor. One afternoon, he showed up at my door unannounced, carrying not a folder of legal documents, but a warm apple pie from the bakery down the street, the one Arthur and I used to frequent on Sunday mornings. "Eleanor, my friend," he said, his gravelly voice gentle as he set the pie on my kitchen table. "You've spent your whole life cooking for other people. It's time to let others take care of you for a little while." He looked around the quiet apartment, his gaze soft with understanding. "But more importantly, it's time for you to start taking care of yourself again. Arthur wouldn't want to see you like this, locked away in here." His words, and especially the mention of my Arthur, were the medicine I didn't know I needed. That week, I made the first real decision to begin again. I remembered how Arthur and I, on our rare days off, used to volunteer at the local church's soup kitchen, preparing meals for the homeless. The feeling of being useful, of feeding those who were truly hungry, had always been the greatest payment. I looked up the nearest parish, Francis House, a bustling community center that served the neighborhood's needy. I walked in, my heart fluttering with a nervousness I hadn't felt in years, and offered my services. The coordinator, a brisk, energetic nun named Sister Agnes, welcomed me with open arms. And just like that, my Tuesday and Thursday mornings gained a new purpose. I would arrive at the community kitchen, tie on a clean white apron, and lose myself in the familiar, comforting rhythm of peeling potatoes, chopping onions, and transforming simple, donated ingredients into hundreds of hot, dignified meals. There, amidst the chaos of giant stockpots and the steam rising from simmering beans, I began to heal. The kitchen was a world of women. I met other volunteers, each with her own story of loss and strength. There was Maria, a widow whose husband had died on September 11th, who needed bread with a fierce, therapeutic energy. There was Sarah, a young mother who had escaped an abusive relationship and found solace in the simple act of sorting donations. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't the victim. I wasn't poor Eleanor. I was just Eleanor, the cook with the magic touch, the woman whose seasoning was praised and whose presence was celebrated. I was building a new family, one bound not by blood, but by shared purpose and mutual affection. While my world began to fill with the scent of real food and the sound of genuine laughter, the world of my tormentors crumbled. The news came to me in updates from Frank, who kept me apprised of the legal process. Then, confronted with the overwhelming evidence, the photos of the documents, the audio recordings from the house, the vials of sedatives and the lethal injection found in his car, and abandoned by his family's high-priced lawyer, who feared being implicated, completely fell apart. In a plea bargain, he confessed to the entire plan, detailing Claire's active participation from the very beginning. His sentence was harsh: 20 years to life in a maximum security prison. The man who dreamed of living off my inheritance would now spend the next several decades living at the expense of the state. For Claire, the path was different, but no less devastating. Her defense, handled by a public defender, argued that she had been coerced, manipulated, a victim of her husband's malignant influence. It was a classic narrative, and for a moment, I feared it might work. But my own testimony, combined with the chilling recording of the conversation where she, in a firm, clear voice, confirmed she was sick to get the money from me, was irrefutable proof of her complicity. The jury did not convict her of attempted murder. They saw her, perhaps rightly, as a follower, not the architect of the plot. But they found her guilty on all other counts: grand larceny, forgery, and conspiracy. The judge, a stern-faced woman who looked at Claire with undisguised contempt, delivered the sentence. "You are a disgrace to the very concept of family," she said, her voice ringing through the silent courtroom. "You preyed on the love and trust of the one person who should have been most sacred to you." Claire's sentence was 5 years. Not in prison, but in a state-run nursing home, where she would be required to work as a caregiver, performing the most basic and humbling tasks: bathing, feeding, and cleaning up after the elderly and infirm. Upon her release, she would face a decade of probation and was ordered to pay me full financial restitution, a debt that, without access to any assets, she would likely spend the rest of her life trying to repay. Justice, in its own way, had been poetic. The daughter who had planned to watch her mother die would now spend her days tending to the dying. The daughter who coveted my money now owed me money. The final attempt at manipulation came a few weeks later. A letter delivered to me by her public defender. The handwriting, once the elegant, looping script I had taught her, was now a shaky, almost illegible scrawl. The letter was a long, whining piece of self-pity. "Mom," it began, "I know I made a mistake, but I'm not a monster." Vince filled my head with ideas. He promised me a life I never had. I was blind. I was scared. He was giving me anxiety medication that made me confused. I didn't know what I was doing. Now I'm alone, with nothing, sentenced to clean up after old people for 5 years. It's a humiliation I don't deserve. Please, Mom, I'm your daughter, the only thing you have left in the world. Forgive me. Tell the judge you forgive me. Maybe they'll lighten my sentence. I need you." I read the letter, my heart heavy. The story of the coerced victim. She took no responsibility. The blame was on Vince, on the medication, on fear. And the plea for forgiveness wasn't an act of contrition. It was a tool, a last-ditch effort to reduce her sentence. My love was, once again, being weaponized against me. I discussed the letter with Frank over coffee. He, with his old cop's wisdom, was direct. "She's using you again, Ellie. Using your forgiveness as a key to get out of jail early. Don't fall for it." I spent a sleepless night, my heart torn between the hurt of the betrayed woman and the residual pain of the mother. The next morning, I wrote my reply. It was short, firm, but not cruel. "Claire, the justice of men has already given you its sentence. Mine will not lighten your burden. The path to forgiveness is a long one, and it does not begin with excuses, but with truth. The truth you must first tell to yourself. When you, and not a lawyer, can look me in the eye and tell me why you lied, why you agreed to erase my life for money, then perhaps the door to a conversation may open. Until then, I pray that you find in your community service the dignity that money could never give you. With sadness, your mother." I gave the letter to Frank, who passed it on to her lawyer. And with that, I closed the chapter. Claire's redemption, if it ever came, would have to be earned, not negotiated. My own life, free from that weight, began to blossom. My informal cooking classes at the soup kitchen became a local sensation. Eleanor's kitchen wisdom became a small event. I didn't just teach recipes. I taught the alchemy of turning simple ingredients into affection, of transforming the act of feeding into an act of love. The money in my savings account, the very same money that had nearly been stolen, now had a new destiny. With Frank's help, I established a small foundation, the Arthur and Eleanor Vance Fund. With it, I financed the monthly purchase of fresh produce and meat for the soup kitchen, and for the very nursing home where Claire was serving her sentence. It was my way of turning evil into good, of giving back to the community what my husband and I had built through a lifetime of honest work. One afternoon, I was at the parish kitchen, showing a group of young single mothers how to bake bread from scratch. The smell of yeast and hope filled the air. I looked at their attentive faces, at their hands covered in flour, and I felt a sense of peace, a sense of purpose that no amount of money in the bank had ever given me. The cook, the woman who had for years served a family that despised her, had found a new table to serve, a bigger, hungrier, more grateful table. And in feeding others, I was finally, truly, nourishing my own soul. The feast of my new life was just beginning, and for the first time, all the guests were welcome. The years that followed the conviction were like the slow healing of a deep wound. First, there was the sharp, constant pain. Then, the gradual formation of a scar. And finally, the quiet acceptance that the mark, though faded, would forever be a part of me. My life, however, blossomed around that scar with a strength I never knew I possessed. My little apartment in Carroll Gardens, once a place of haunted silence, became a hub of gentle activity. The Arthur and Eleanor Vance Fund prospered, not in size, but in impact. With the money that was once coveted to finance a life of empty luxury, we insured the pantry at St. Francis House was always full. The name of my husband, a simple, honest working man, became synonymous with a hot meal for dozens of families struggling to make ends meet. It was a legacy of nourishment, a far cry from the legacy of greed Vince had envisioned. Arthur would have been so proud. My cooking classes for the young mothers in the neighborhood became the highlight of my week. I taught them more than just recipes. I taught them household economy, the art of stretching a dollar, of turning humble ingredients into nutritious and flavorful meals. I shared the tricks I'd learned over 50 years in kitchens, both grand and modest. How to make a savory pie from leftover roast chicken, how to bake bread that tasted like a luxury but cost mere pennies, how to make a soup that could warm not just the body, but the soul. I became Eleanor to the community, a matriarch whose advice and whose seasoning were equally valued. Of Claire, the news came in trickles, brought to me by Frank, who still checked in on me regularly. He had a contact inside the state system who would give him discreet updates. My daughter was serving her sentence at the Hopewell Senior Care Facility, a grim, underfunded institution on the far edge of the city. For the first few months, the reports were bleak. She was a shadow of resentment, performing her duties mechanically, cleaning rooms and changing soiled linens with a silent, simmering rage. She was an outcast among the other staff, who knew her story and treated her with a mixture of contempt and fear. But time, and the relentless, daily confrontation with the fragility and loneliness of old age, began to work a slow, profound transformation. She was surrounded by people who had lost everything: their health, their homes, their families, their memories. In their vacant eyes and trembling hands, she began to see a reflection of her own spiritual poverty. "You should see her, Ellie," Frank told me over the phone one evening, about a year into her sentence. His voice held a note of genuine surprise. "My guy says she's changed. She's not that spoiled girl anymore." The other day, he saw her sitting for over an hour next to a woman with advanced Alzheimer's, just holding her hand and humming old show tunes. The old lady was agitated, and Claire just calmed her right down. He says she has a knack for it. A gentle touch. A way with them that, well, that reminds him of you. That news was the first crack of light through a door I thought I had sealed shut forever. I didn't respond. I didn't reach out. It wasn't time. Her change had to be for herself, not for me. When Claire's 5-year sentence was complete, she did not contact me. To my surprise, Frank informed me that she had petitioned the state to allow her to continue working at Hopewell, this time as a contracted employee, for minimum wage. She had found, in her punishment, a vocation. She rented a tiny room in a boarding house nearby, living a life of monastic simplicity, a world away from the designer clothes and expensive dinners she and Vince had once craved. She was, for the first time in her adult life, building something of her own, however small. The first gesture of reconciliation came on the anniversary of Arthur's death. As I did every year, I took the subway to the cemetery in Queens to place a small bouquet of white chrysanthemums on his grave. As I approached the simple granite headstone, my heart gave a jolt. Already sitting on the polished stone was a small, old-fashioned aluminum lunch pail, the kind I used to pack for Arthur every single day for 30 years. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid. Inside was a perfect portion of meatloaf with a side of mashed potatoes and green beans, Arthur's favorite meal. Tucked alongside it was a small, simple note, written on a piece of torn notebook paper in my daughter's familiar script. For Dad. And for the mom who taught me how to make this. With a sorrow that has no words. Claire. I sat down on the cold stone bench opposite my husband's grave, the lunch pail in my lap, and I wept. Not tears of sadness, but of a fragile, stubborn hope that was beginning to sprout in the barren ground of my heart. She remembered. After everything, she still remembered. I decided it was time. The following week, I took the long bus ride to the edge of the city. The Hopewell Senior Care Facility was even grimmer up close than I had imagined. A squat brick building that seemed to sag under the weight of its own sadness. I walked in and asked the woman at the front desk if I could speak to Claire Thorne. I found her in the back garden. A small, paved courtyard with a few anemic rose bushes. She was helping a frail old man in a wheelchair, gently tucking a blanket around his thin shoulders. She wore the simple blue scrubs of a caregiver, her hair pulled back in a plain ponytail. When she looked up and saw me, she froze. Her face was a canvas of panic and shame. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic pronouncements. We just looked at each other across the small courtyard. A chasm of pain and years between us. Your meatloaf, I said finally, my voice softer than I expected. It was almost as good as mine. You forgot the pinch of nutmeg. A smile. The first true, unforced smile I had seen on her face in over a decade flickered at the corners of her mouth. I know, Mom, she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. I tried, but I can never get your seasoning just right. One day, I said, taking a small step closer. If you want, I'll teach you. And that is how we began again. With a missing spice and a door cracked open. She started visiting me on Sundays. Not at my old apartment, which I had finally sold, using the proceeds to bolster the foundation, but at the new, smaller, sunnier apartment I had moved into, just a block from St. Francis' house. Our conversations were tentative at first, focused on the present. She would tell me about her work, about the residents she cared for. She spoke of them with a deep, quiet empathy I had never seen in her before. She told me their stories, their small joys, their profound losses. And I saw in my daughter a compassion, a strength, that I thought had been extinguished forever. The final gesture. The proof that the harvest of my love and my pain had finally yielded its most precious fruit, came the following Christmas. Claire told me she had a gift for me, but that it was a surprise. On Christmas morning, she picked me up in her old, beat-up car. We're going somewhere, Mom, she said, her eyes shining with a secret excitement. She drove me to St. Francis' house. The community kitchen, normally dark and silent on Christmas Day, was ablaze with light and full of life. A long table had been set up in the main hall, decorated with handmade paper chains and pine boughs. And seated around it were a dozen of the loneliest residents from Hopewell, the ones who had no family to visit them, the ones who would otherwise spend the day staring at the four walls of their rooms. What is all this, Claire? I asked, my voice choked with emotion. It's your present, Mom, she said, handing me a clean white apron. I've learned in my work that the greatest hunger isn't for food. It's for connection. And I remembered how you always turn food into love. So, with the help of my colleagues from Hopewell and the volunteers from the parish, I organized this. We're calling it the Eleanor's Table Christmas Lunch. She then led me into the kitchen. On the stove, in large, simmering pots, was a complete Christmas dinner: roast turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes, gravy, all prepared by her and a few other volunteers, following my recipes, which she had been asking me for over the preceding weeks under various false pretenses. I couldn't buy you jewelry, Mom. I don't have any money for that, she said, her eyes glistening. But I could give you this. A chance to do what you do best, to care. And a chance for me to finally be your helper. That day, my daughter and I cooked and served side by side. I watched her tend to the elderly guests with a tenderness and respect that was a mirror image of the care I had once given her. I saw the joy on the faces of those old men and women who had been given a family for a day. At the end of the meal, Claire stood up and, in a voice that was timid but firm, she raised her glass of sparkling cider. "I'd like to make a toast," she said, her eyes finding mine across the room. "To my mother, Eleanor, a woman who taught me, in the hardest way possible, that a true inheritance isn't the money you receive, but the good you do, and that the best seasoning in life is, and always will be, love. Thank you, Mom, for never giving up on me." At that moment, looking at my daughter, at the grateful faces around the table, I understood Arthur's true legacy. It wasn't the money in the savings account. It was the example. An example that, even through a twisted path of pain and error, had finally found its destination. The values had been passed on after all. My name is Eleanor Vance. I am 78 years old, and my life is rich. Rich with friends, with purpose, with flowers in my window box, and rich with a daughter who has become the woman I always dreamed she would be. The Eleanor's Table lunch has become an annual tradition, and every year, our table gets bigger. I have discovered that sometimes, a mother's greatest act of love isn't giving her children what they want, but having the courage to take everything away, so that they can finally discover the incalculable value of building something for themselves. The first few Sundays Claire came to visit were a delicate dance of unspoken things. We moved around the kitchen of my new apartment, a space much smaller than the one in Carroll Gardens but filled with so much more light. We chopped vegetables in a shared, comfortable silence. The air between us was thick with the ghosts of words we couldn't yet say. Betrayal, forgiveness, pain, sorrow. So instead, we spoke the language we both understood best, the language of food. A little more salt in the stew. Think. I'd say. I was thinking the same thing. She would reply. And the small agreement felt like a peace treaty. She never spoke of Vince. His name was a locked room in the house of our past, and neither of us had the key, or perhaps the courage, to open it. I learned from Frank that he had been transferred to a maximum security facility, upstate after a fight with another inmate. He had vanished from our lives as completely as if he had never existed, leaving behind only the scorched earth of his greed. Claire spoke instead of her residence at Hopewell. She talked about Mr. Henderson, a former jazz pianist whose fingers, now gnarled with arthritis, would still dance on the edge of his blanket as if playing a phantom keyboard. She told me about Mrs. Gable, a woman who had lost her ability to speak but whose eyes, Claire said, could tell 1,000 stories. She had learned to read those stories, to understand the flicker of joy at the sight of a bird outside the window, the shadow of fear during a thunderstorm. As I listened, I saw a woman I didn't recognize, the restless, dissatisfied girl who was always chasing the next shiny object was gone. In her place was a woman of profound patience and quiet strength. Her work was not glamorous. It was hard, often thankless, and emotionally draining. But it had etched a new kind of beauty onto her face. A beauty born not of expensive creams and perfect makeup, but of empathy. It was the beauty of a soul that had been broken and then painstakingly pieced back together, stronger in the broken places. One Sunday, She arrived with a small, potted orchid. "It's for you," she said, placing it on the windowsill. "I saved up for it. I know how much you love flowers." It was a simple gift, but it was monumental. It was the first thing she had ever given me that she had earned with her own 2 hands, with the sweat of her own honest labor. I touched one of the delicate, waxy petals, my throat tight with emotion. "It's beautiful, Claire," I whispered. "Thank you." The Eleanor's table Christmas lunch became our anchor. The one day of the year where the past and present could meet in a space of pure, uncomplicated service. The second year, we fed 20 people. The third, 30. It grew beyond just the residents of Hopewell. We opened the doors to anyone in the neighborhood who was alone on Christmas, the elderly, the recently widowed, the struggling young families. My little foundation provided the funds. Claire did the organizing. And I, along with my army of volunteers from St. Francis House, did the cooking. It was during our 4th Christmas lunch that the first real crack appeared in the wall of silence between us. We were in the kitchen, side by side, plating slices of turkey. The dining hall was filled with the happy chatter of our guests. "He used to love Christmas," Claire said suddenly, her voice quiet. She didn't need to say the name. We both knew she was talking about Arthur. "He would always insist on hanging the tinsel on the tree, one strand at a time. He said it looked like icicles that way." I stopped what I was doing, a spoonful of gravy hovering over a plate. I looked at her. Her eyes were distant, lost in a memory from a life before Vince, before everything had gone so terribly wrong. "He did," I said, my own voice soft. "He had more patience than any man I ever knew. I used to get so frustrated with him," she confessed, a sad smile playing on her lips. "I just wanted to throw it all on and be done. I didn't understand. I didn't understand that the slowness, the care, that was the whole point." She paused, turning to face me, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I didn't understand so many things, Mom." It was the opening I had waited for, the one I had prayed for but never dared to ask for. I put down the ladle and took her hands in mine. Her skin was rougher now, the nails cut short and practical. They were working hands. "Tell me," I said gently. "Help me understand." And so she did. The story poured out of her, a torrent of shame and regret. She spoke of her deep-seated insecurity, her feeling of being less than her friends who had married wealthy men. She spoke of Vince's charm, how he had preyed on that insecurity, promising her a world where she would finally feel important, admired. He made it sound so simple, so logical. She whispered, her voice breaking. "He said you were old, that your money was just sitting there, useless. He said it was our duty to liberate it, to put it to good use. He twisted everything. Mom, he made greed sound like a virtue. And I was so weak, so desperate to believe him." She told me about the pills. He had told her they were for anxiety, but she knew, deep down, they were making her foggy, compliant. It was easier to live in that fog than to face the monstrous reality of what they were planning. "But I can't blame the pills," she said, looking me straight in the eye, her gaze unflinching. This was the moment of truth. I could have stopped it. There were so many times I could have said no. The day he showed me the forged will, the day he brought home the death certificate, I could have screamed. I could have called the police. I could have called you. "Why didn't you?" I asked, the question a raw ache in my chest. "Because I was a coward," she said, the words raw and brutal. "And because a part of me, terrible, ugly part of me, wanted it. I wanted the money. I wanted the easy life. I looked at you, at the life you and Dad built, a life of saving and sacrificing, and I thought it was small. I was ashamed of it. I was ashamed of you." And that is the truth that I will have to live with for the rest of my life. The confession hung in the air between us, stark and painful and utterly liberating. The final ghost had been exorcised. The truth, in all its ugliness, was finally on the table. I pulled her into my arms, holding my daughter for the first time in nearly a decade. She felt thin, fragile, but strong, like a reed that has bent in the storm but not broken. She sobbed against my shoulder, deep, racking sobs of a grief long held in check. I held her tight, stroking her hair, my own tears mingling with hers. There were no easy words of forgiveness. There was no magical absolution. There was only the shared reality of our pain, and the silent, powerful promise of a new beginning, built not on lies or illusions, but on the bedrock of a terrible, cleansing truth. The seasoning, I whispered into her hair when her sobs had quieted. The nutmeg in the meatloaf. Your father's mother taught me that. She said it was the secret ingredient. It adds a warmth, a depth that you can't quite name, but you'd miss it if it were gone. She pulled back, her face tear-streaked but clear. Warmth, she repeated softly. Depth. I think I'm finally starting to understand what that means. From that day on, something shifted. The dance was over. We started to talk. Really talk. She told me more about her life. About the small triumphs at work, convincing a resident who refused to eat to finally take a spoonful of soup. Receiving a rare, gummy smile from a man lost in the fog of dementia. She was finding her inheritance not in a bank account, but in these small, sacred moments of human connection. And I told her about my life, about the joy I found in my classes, about the new friends I had made, about the quiet satisfaction of seeing Arthur's name attached to something so good and life-affirming. We were two women, a mother and a daughter, who had been to hell and back. We had lost everything, and in doing so, we had found the only thing that truly mattered. One spring afternoon, she called me, her voice buzzing with an excitement I hadn't heard in years. Mom, I have an idea. Crazy idea. But I need your help. I'm listening, I said, smiling into the phone. The foundation. She began. It does so much good. But what if we could do more? What if we could create a place? Not a soup kitchen. Not a nursing home. But something in between. A place for people like my residents. People who are lonely. Who just need a hot meal and a friendly face for a few hours a day. A community cafe. But one where the food is free. And the currency is conversation. She called it Arthur's Table. A place built on the values he had lived by: dignity, community, and the simple, profound power of a shared meal. The idea of Arthur's Table took root in our hearts and grew with a life of its own. It was an audacious dream, born from the ashes of our shared trauma. It was Claire's vision, fueled by her years of first-hand experience with the crushing loneliness of the elderly. And it was my legacy, the culmination of a lifetime spent turning simple ingredients into expressions of love. We decided to pour everything we had into with remaining funds from the foundation. Our time, our energy, our hope. We found a small, neglected storefront for rent just a few blocks from my apartment. A former bakery with dusty windows and peeling paint. To others, it was an eyesore. It was a canvas. We spent the next 6 months transforming it. Frank, now fully retired but as energetic as ever, became our unofficial project manager, calling in favors from old friends: plumbers, electricians, painters who worked for a fair price and a steady supply of my homemade lasagna. The volunteers from St. Francis House and even some of the off-duty staff from Hopewell joined our cause. They scraped old paint, sanded floors, and assembled second-hand furniture we found at thrift stores. The space slowly came to life, not with the cold, impersonal shine of a commercial restaurant, but with the warm, eclectic charm of a well-loved home. We painted the walls a cheerful, buttery yellow, We hung framed photographs of old Brooklyn street scenes. Claire filled the windowsills with potted herbs, rosemary, thyme, basil who's fresh. Green scent chased away the last ghosts of neglect. Claire was the heart of the operation. She handled the permits, the paperwork, the endless logistics. I watched in awe as my once timid daughter negotiated with suppliers, organized volunteer schedules, and spoke with a quiet confidence that was utterly captivating. She had found her voice, not in demanding what she felt she was owed, but in advocating for those who had nothing. I was the soul. My domain was the kitchen, a gleaming, professional space we had designed with the last of the foundation's money. It was the kitchen of my dreams. On the day it was finished, I ran my hand over the cool stainless steel countertops and felt a sense of homecoming so profound it brought tears to my eyes. This was where I belonged. Arthur's table opened on a crisp autumn morning, the kind of day my husband had loved best. We didn't have a grand opening or a ribbon-cutting ceremony. We just unlocked the door, put a fresh pot of coffee on to brew, and placed a simple, hand-painted sign in the window. A hot meal and a warm welcome. All are invited. Our first customer was a familiar face, Mr. Henderson, the former jazz pianist from Hopewell. Claire had arranged for a volunteer to bring him. He sat at a small table by the window, his gnarled fingers tapping a silent rhythm on the polished wood. I brought him a bowl of my chicken and barley soup, the steam rising to meet his smiling face. Within an hour, the place was full. Elderly people from the neighborhood, single parents with young children, lonely souls seeking a moment of connection. The room filled with the low, happy hum of conversation, the clinking of spoons against bowls, the sound of a community being born. Claire moved through the room like a gracious host, refilling coffee cups, listening to stories, offering a kind word or a gentle touch on the shoulder. She was radiant. She wasn't just serving food. She was serving dignity. I watched her from the pass-through window of my kitchen, my heart so full I thought it might burst. I saw the way an old woman's face lit up when Claire complimented her scarf, the way a shy young man relaxed when she asked about his day. This was her true inheritance. Not the money, not the apartment. This ability to see the humanity in others, to offer comfort without judgment, to build a table where everyone had a seat. We fell into a new rhythm. 4 days a week, from 11 to 3, Arthur's table was open. Claire ran the front of the house, and I ran the back. We were a team, a well-oiled machine built on a foundation of shared purpose. Our difficult past was never forgotten, but it no longer defined us. It had become the fertile ground from which this beautiful, life-affirming project had grown. One afternoon, a few years after we opened, a young woman came in. She was a journalist from a local Brooklyn newspaper who had heard about our little cafe. She sat with me and Claire, a notebook in her hand, and asked us to tell her our story. I hesitated. We had never spoken publicly about what had happened. It was our private scar. Claire reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. "It's okay, Mom," she said softly. "It's part of the story." And so, we told her. We didn't spare the ugly details, the greed, the betrayal, the arrest. But we also told her about the healing, the forgiveness, and the redemption that had been found in the humble act of serving others. When the article was published, I was terrified. I thought people would judge us, that they would stare at Claire with condemnation. But the opposite happened. The community rallied around us. Donations poured in. More volunteers signed up. People would stop us on the street, not to whisper or point, but to thank us for our honesty, to share their own stories of broken families and hard-won forgiveness. Our story of private pain had become a public testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Today, I am 82 years old. My steps are a little slower, and my hands, though still skilled, are spotted with age. But my life is fuller and richer than I could ever have imagined. Arthur's table is thriving. A beloved neighborhood institution. Claire is its heart, soul, and its future. She never married again. Never had children of her own. Her family is the collection of beautiful, broken people who gather at our tables each day. She has found in them a love far more profound and lasting than any romance. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before we open, I'll stand in my kitchen, the scent of baking bread and simmering soup filling the air, and watch my daughter as she arranges flowers on the tables. I see in her the best parts of her father, his quiet strength, his unwavering integrity, and I see, I hope, the best parts of Mimi's love of nurturing, my belief that a good meal can heal almost anything. The inheritance Arthur and I worked so hard to build was not a number in a bank account. It was a set of values. It took a long and treacherous journey, a journey through the darkest corners of the human heart, for that inheritance to be truly claimed. But it was. My name is Eleanor Vance, and I am a cook. I have learned that life can serve you the most bitter of dishes, can serve you betrayal, and loss, and a grief so deep you think it will consume you. But if you are brave, and if you are patient, and if you never, ever forget the secret ingredient which is, and always will be, love, you can transform even the most bitter meal into a feast. A feast for the hungry, a feast for the lonely, a feast for the soul. And at my table, everyone is welcome.